Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University. Welcome everybody back to Fish University, where we're coming at you today from cold Starkville, Mississippi. This morning it was probably in the low 20s. Quite cold for Mississippi weather in December, or actually November still. Wow, wrong time of the year. This episode won't actually air until probably January or February, but it's pretty cold here. And today I've got a really exciting guest. Some of you probably know him, especially if you've been doing anything with pond management over the years. My guest today is the one, the only Bob Lusk, also known as the Pond Boss, also known as the Dean of the Institute of Higher Pondology. Bob, tell me, how are you doing today, Bob?
I'm still leading a pretty cool life, Wes. I'm telling you, it's pretty fun to be me. I can do some cool stuff.
Yeah, you get to work with some pretty cool people and build a lot of really neat bodies of water that produce incredible fishing. And that's what we're going to talk to Bob about today. I said, he and I could probably record 200 episodes on 200 different topics. He's done so much and been so involved in the private fish management world for so many years, from the early design phases all the way up to the producing the largest fish possible. So Bob has a lot of experience in this. As I said, he not only is he a private pond consultant, he is the owner and chief editor of Pond Boss Magazine, which if you subscribe to Pond Boss Magazine, you're probably familiar with that because, it's probably the only private sector magazine that deals specifically with managing smaller bodies of water. So, and Bob, weren't you in the last year or two inducted into the Fisheries Hall of Excellence?
Yeah, I was. I didn't see that coming, but it's deeply appreciated. Yes. So thanks for bringing that up.
Bob has years and years of experience, possibly more than just about anybody else in the field. And I'm super excited to have him here today. Bob has built some of the best fishing lakes that I know of around the country. So we were just talking about, he was up here in Mississippi not a week or two ago, doing some work on a lake that was built a few years ago for that purpose. So if you're going to pick somebody's brain about how to build the perfect pond, this is the guy I want to talk to. So
wow. Thank you very much.
I could have spent, the next 60 minutes talking about how important you are, Bob.
Yeah.
Let's get right into it, Bob. I read an article online not too long ago that was discussing the do's and don'ts, essentially, of building the perfect pond. And I thought that would be the perfect topic for us to discuss because, a lot of folks out there, they want to create their pond paradise. And, they want to make sure they build it right from the beginning. And a lot of times what we recommend in extension is fairly simplistic. Here's how you build a simple pond. Make sure it holds water. Make sure it doesn't have weed problems. But Bob, you take it to a whole nother level. You take it to a level to making sure the fish have everything they need to thrive, and that the angler could know where to find the fish, can concentrate the fish in certain areas. I know that one of the first things I tell people is that before you do anything, you need to know your objective. Would you agree?
Totally agree with that. I just met with a father and son earlier this week, and they want to build about a 4 to 5 acre lake. And, the father is, I think, 72 years old and the son is 50. And the son has got kids that are in their teenage years, and pretty soon they'll be grown and then he'll have grandkids. And I sat down and asked both those guys, why do you want this lake? What's the mission? And the granddad says, well, first of all, I want to be able to see beautiful water and catch some fish big enough that I can eat some bluegill. And he said, I'd like to have a food plot right across the pond so I can see deer. And then the son said, you know what? I really want a chance at catching some pretty big fish, But I want my teenagers to be able to come out and have a good time and catch some, big bluegill and some decent sized bass. Then the father chimed in, the granddad, and he said, you know what? And I want it to be safe. If somebody falls in, I want them to be able to get out. So I wrote down all those objectives, and everybody's objectives are a little bit different. Some folks want to have a place of serenity where they can go sit down and read a book, or they want a hiking trail and be able to see water. But almost every one of them I work with want to grow really big fish and be able to catch them. So we start with objectives. That's where we start every single time. And it's amazing how so many objectives are different. But when you really start nailing it down, there's only about 5 or 6 objectives, and they're pretty close to the same everywhere I go.
Yeah, and it's important, too, I think, to note that occasionally objectives can be mutually exclusive. For example, if one person tells you they want to have crystal clear water so that they can swim, and one person says they want to have a lake that can attract ducks, another person wants to have a great crappie lake, and the fourth person wants trophy bass. I mean, you really can't do all that in one lake, can you, Bob?
No, not unless you've got a back pocket bigger than most folks and a big piece of land. Yeah. So you're right. And it's real important to really nail down what those objectives are. What are the goals? What's your mission? Why'd you buy this place? Once we know what their goals are, we're here, and now we figure out what do they have to work with, and we got to take what they've got and get it to here so that they reach their goals.
Do you find at times you need to help people refine their goals and objectives to meet what's feasible on the property? Exactly.
Every time. Yeah. Every time. And one of the approach that I take now, it's different than it was 25 years ago when I was learning how to do this. The approach I take now is oftentimes they truly haven't thought about their goals. So not only do they need to refine them, they got to think about it. And I guarantee you Monday when I talked to those guys, they wanted a lake or a pond, and they wanted it right here. That's what they wanted, but they hadn't really dug down deep enough in the process to have some goals figured out. So not only do we oftentimes have to refine goals, we got to dig them out of people to find out, because it's kind of hard to hit a moving target. If we don't have goals, we certainly won't accomplish them.
Now, once you've worked with them, you've set the objectives and the goals for the lake, the next step would be to make sure that they have a good site.
Yes.
So what goes into a good site?
Well, before I ever show up to the property, it usually starts with a phone call or an email or a social media message. And then we'll have a conversation, and I'll find out where the property is, and I'll spend time on maps. I'll look at the topography, I'll look at aerial imagery, I look at history, and then the first step in my process is I like to look at the maps and see, is there a place to build a dam, or is this a section of land where it's so flat it needs to be excavated? And then I measure the watershed, how many acres feed into that site. The size of the pond is going to be contingent on the size of the watershed, unless they have a well that they can use for it, So I'm looking at siting the dam on a map, and I'm looking at how big is the watershed to feed it. That tells us about how big the pond will be. And then the next step is I start looking at soil maps. We got to find clay. If we can't find clay, then we're going to go another direction. So watershed size and soil types and siting the dam are the first things I look at on a map before I ever show up to the property.
Of course. And you also, when you're looking at the map, you're trying to make sure there's nothing within the watershed that could be a problem. Chicken houses upstream, or a feed lot for cattle, or something that could cause problems down the road. I have a pond I manage on campus that is super productive, and I've been told that it's because within the watershed there are septic fields that are leaching into the ground and eventually making it into ponds. So
back in the spring, I helped a guy in northeastern Missouri who bought a parcel of land that was not ag productive. And the farmer that sold him to him is a corn farmer. And surrounding that entire 6-acre lake site are acres and acres of corn, and that's the watershed. So when we designed that pond, this guy's also in the stormwater business, the owner. And he designed 4 different silt catchment ponds in each finger of this lake, and he rip-wrapped them, and he created plant filters. So he's capturing the water before it ever gets to his pond. So these catchment basins can kind of clean the water up before it gets into his lake. So there's all kinds of little things that we think about. There's another guy that I helped in Iowa, eastern Iowa, east central Iowa, and he's surrounded by hay pastures. Well, each year the farmer fertilizes his hay pastures before he cuts the hay. So he wanted to build a couple of little silt traps to capture water before it comes into his pond or his lake. And so there's a lot of things we think about, and the surrounding terrain sure does make a difference on what we do when we design that fishing lake.
I just visited last week a lake down in not far from Natchez, Mississippi, that one of the neighboring properties decided to deforest, to cut about 600 acres of old forest, old growth forest. And if you know anything about that area around Natchez, that's old escarpment land.
Yes.
It's, loess soils that have built up through millions of years. And then when you deforest it, it all washes away. And that lake, you can look at it on Google Earth right now. It was chocolate milk within a year after. They had forest all around them. But actions within the watershed certainly can affect you down the road as well. So you need to be aware of what your neighbors are planning to do.
That's good. That's good advice.
So, Bob, once you've got that site picked out, the next step is finding a contractor. I think this is one of the more difficult things for a future pond owner to do. I don't think we maintain good lists. There's a lot of folks that can move dirt. There's not a lot of folks that can build a pond. What do you look for in a contractor?
Well, the first thing I do is when we get ready to interview contractors, look for somebody locally that knows the local soils and has done it. It's built ponds and lakes, it's built dams. One of the expectations that I have is I don't expect any earth mover locally to know how to build the living, breathing entity of the lake, but I do expect them to know how to build the dam. And so the dam it's a structure. It's got to be built on the right foundation, which means you got to create a foundation. It needs to be cored. You got to have the right kind of core trench. So the dam has a job, and its job is to impound water and then release excess water in an orderly fashion. And so I want to find a contractor that not only has built a number of dams, but understands all those concepts and then has the equipment. Now, I'll never forget one of the first lakes I designed 25 years ago. When I first started talking to the landowner, his brother-in-law had a D6 bulldozer. And he said, I want my brother-in-law to work on this dam. And it was going to be a massive dam. They were going to spend, 6 figures on it. They needed pan scrapers. They're going to have to haul clay several hundred yards away from the side of a hill, which was the only place they had clay. So I told him, I said, hey, Jody, listen, you don't want to mess up Thanksgiving. Because if your brother-in-law's got a dozer, he cannot, no matter how good he is, he can't build this dam properly. But what he can do is some clearing. So we had that understanding that you had to find the right contractor with the right equipment to do that job. If it's a small pond, might be able to do it with a bulldozer. But you can't compact dirt with a bulldozer. Finding the right contractor that's built that kind of project before, that is willing to work with you and listen about the inside of the lake and has the right equipment to do it, I think that's the backbone. And it may not be the first person you talk to. And I'll tell you this, it won't be the cheapest person you talk to. Every single time I've watched somebody a contractor bid on a job, it doesn't end that way. So don't pick the cheapest one. Pick the one that's the best suited for that job. That's a real important piece of advice. Something else I tell people, if you do get a bid, add 25% to that bid and don't be surprised if you spend that much. And the reason is when you start digging into dirt, you don't know what's underground. You don't know if there's a 6-foot vein of gravel 10 feet under the ground, and you don't know if there's a Model T Ford perch that was dumped into a creek that's now a swale, So until the contractor starts getting underground and moving dirt around, you really don't know what to expect.
Have you found some cool things like in your years of doing this?
Yeah, we found there was a project my good friend Mike Otto was working on years ago, and he was going to build about a 3-acre lake for these folks. And so he started to do the core, and he felt that he was doing it with a track hoe, and he said he felt metal scrape on his bucket down about 12 feet, and he started digging. It was an old trash pit. And in that trash pit, there was a slip, a Fresno. There was a fender off of a Model T Ford, and he excavated some pretty cool stuff, and I got to go down there and watch him do that. Found a buffalo skull one time that was buried in the side of a creek in Nebraska, and where I guess the buffaloes crossed that creek just, several hundred years ago, and there was this ancient buffalo skull in the side of the creek. So you can find some pretty cool stuff. Fossils, things like that. Neat stuff.
Wow. When you bring a contractor in, I mean, they're usually going to be experienced at building the levee, compacting the clay, but how about like water control structures? Do you provide the advice on that, or do you work with someone else?
Yeah, I start with that, but I try to stay in my lane as a fisheries biologist. And so if, like, for example, if we're working on a site where the watershed is probably 15 acres per acre of lake that they want to build, watershed's a little bit large, then I'm inclined to have them talk to an engineer and make sure that they've got the right water release structures. There's some contractors that will not install a pipe in a dam, and they won't do it because they've been snake bit by it. Because when you install a pipe in a dam, you've got to do it right. It's got to be compacted by hand. It's got to have anti-seep collars. It's got to be the right material. Nobody uses corrugated aluminum anymore, or corrugated metal. They don't use that anymore because it doesn't last long enough. To answer the question is, almost every site I look and see if an overflow pipe is necessary. Then we have that discussion, and the contractor that's going to install it plays a role in that discussion. There's some guys that just won't do it. There's other guys that won't do it without it. So that's pretty site specific too, based on how much water flow rate that we can expect during a 100-year flood.
So what do you do when you've picked a contractor? If they refuse to install the pipe, do you hire someone else to do that, or do you find a new contractor for the whole project?
We try to make those decisions before the contractor's hired.
Okay.
So in other words, we try to come up with the scope of the work. What's the job look like? And sometimes the contractor's involved in that. Since they're going to be moving the dirt, let's let them help estimate how much dirt needs to be moved. And do they want to, are you willing to install a pipe? And sometimes, like I looked at a project yesterday over near Longview, Texas, and the contractor did not want to install the pipe. But the landowner was adamant. We're going to have this pipe. I've bought it. Here it is. We're putting it in. And then the landowner was there helping to install the pipe. So that contractor didn't have a choice. As it turned out, I looked at it yesterday. It looks stellar. They did a great job. And that's going to be a valuable asset for that lake. It's in an area that gets 55 to 60 inches of rain every year. And this landowner, if he wants to draw the lake down 5 or 6 feet to do some work on it 10 years down the road, now he'll be able to do that. And they'll have a bottom water release drain too, or bottom water release pipe, because he's going to have an overflow on the backside slope of his dam built into the dam, where when it rains, it overflows on the backside. And he's in an area where it won't freeze. So there's okay. Each site stands on its own merits, and some of that's based on goals, and some of that's based on necessity.
And a lot of folks, they're not likely to have a Bob Lusk come over and help them build the pond. So when you guys are out choosing a contractor, one of the best things you can do is ask them to tell you, some other ponds that they've built. Go talk to those landowners, see if their ponds are holding water, see if they're satisfied. Make sure you get some references from an unknown contractor that you don't know whether or not they're capable of building a pond.
Yeah, and I'll tell you some advice Mike Otto gives. Go to the repair shops and ask who pays their bills. I love that. Otto does that. He tells people that all the time. You can go through the NRCS office. They usually have a list, but they won't make recommendations. They're not allowed to do that. But local contractors that have been around a long time, they should be able to give you a list of references and even take you around and show you ponds that they've built. I'm going to say that this is real important. It sits squarely on the shoulders of that landowner for the pond to be built correctly. It does not sit on the shoulders of the contractor. So the more work, due diligence, planning that the landowner does, the better result that landowner is going to get. The contractor's there to do a job, and he's going to represent himself and do what he knows. He doesn't know what he doesn't know, but he can do a good job at what he's good at. As long as that fits your project needs and the scope of the work, then that's a good contractor.
Bob, is there a particular time of year that you prefer to start a pond project? Better to do it in the dry summer, the cold winter?
It's better to do it when it's not raining.
It's not raining. So
not raining.
Whenever your dry season is, it's a good idea to focus it around that time period.
Yes. And here's another piece of advice. All the best dirt movers in today's marketplace are anywhere from 6 months to 18 months out. So I tell you this, I think it's really smart to do your planning phase and spend as much time as you need, but be sure to book your contractor months away. Don't start planning the pond, say, I want to pull the trigger now, and then think you're going to go get the best contractor, because you're probably not, because all the good ones are working on something now with 2 or 3 more lined up. Since we're talking about contractors, I have several pet peeves. Here's my number one pet peeve with earth moving contractors. The good ones know how to do it. They'll do it for you, but there's somebody on their phone every day asking when they're going to be coming to their place. So they're trying to get in, get your work done, finish it up, and then go to the next one. And what happens is very rarely do they finish strong. They'll leave some things undone. Maybe I looked at one outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the contractor finished, but he didn't finish strong. He didn't finish placing all the habitat where we asked him to do it. He didn't harrow the backside of the dam and rake out all the roots and sticks and stuff where the landowner could plant grass on it and be able to mow the backside slope of the dam. So one of my pet peeves is too many earth moving contractors don't finish strong. They might lose 2 or 3 days to weather. And when that happens, that puts them 2 or 3 days late for the next job. And they're always looking at the next job. So that's a pretty important tip. Is as the landowner, the one that's going to live with that pond after the contractor's gone, hold them accountable. You're paying them good money or they wouldn't be doing it. And be sure to have them finish strong. That's a big deal.
Good points. Good points, Bob. I appreciate that. So now we've got our contractor. Our contractors come in. They've built the levee. They have a water control structures in place. They're ready to hold water. That's a great time before the pond fills to do a lot of work to the pond. And you mentioned habitat. A lot of times that's the contractor building things like underwater humps and points and rock piles, but it also may be the landowner coming in and making gravel beds or putting out artificial structures. There's a lot of things that need to be done and can be done best when the pond is not full of water. It's hard to do things in the pond bottom when you've got 6 to 8 feet of water lying on top of it. So what are some of the things you think people should do before they close the valve and let the pond start to fill?
The most important thing at that point is to accessorize the pond. That's what I call it. You want to accessorize it. The way I describe it to people is we like to build underwater communities based on the goals. So if the goals are, I want to grow big fish, well, it takes about 10 pounds of bait fish to grow 1 pound of game fish. And actually, at every trophic level, it takes 10 pounds of plankton to grow 1 pound of bugs, 10 pounds of bugs to grow 1 pound of small fish, on and on and on. So I look at the inside of the lake based on the merit of that site to design communities, underwater communities. So what we want to do is create habitat, and my little catchphrase is, as goes the habitat, so goes what lives in it. What I mean by that is we want to be able to have places where fish can reproduce, especially bluegills and red ear sunfish and that initial stocking of fathead minnows. So people need to know the life histories of those fish and understand what they need to be able to reproduce to provide that mass that's going to be the food chain, over in perpetuity, hopefully. And so I like to start on my underwater communities with spawning beds. So I like to have, what I tell people is let's find a spot that you can make as flat as possible in water about 3 feet deep, put down some geotech cloth and 3 inches of pea gravel on it, make that a spawning bed. Then everything else emanates out from that spawning bed. So right adjacent to the spawning bed, there's a 3-to-1 slope. Odds are pretty high that they're going to get some native plants growing there after the lake is full. But then we also need some kind of dense structure like rock piles for baby bait fish to hide on and periphyton to grow on the rocks provide food. And then I like to have whatever nature offers. I always start with what nature offers. If they've got timber, let's use timber. If they've got rock, let's use rock. And so it kind of depends on where we are, but I like to create some kind of dense enough habitat that's attractive to small bait fish and set it up with edge cover for predator fish. And then adjacent to that, maybe some root balls turned upside down. And then right next to that oak tree that they took down in the basin of the lake and cut the small limbs off of it so largemouth bass can hide in it. So I like to design underwater communities with travel paths, creek channels, humps, whatever that site offers. And the magic number, people always ask me how much. If we cover 25 to 30% of the basin of a pond or a lake, that's enough. I mean, I looked at the lake not long ago where there was way too much. They built the dam, but they didn't clean out the basin of the lake, and it was nothing but standing timber 100%. That lake will fail. It has to. Then I've also seen lakes where maybe a 5 or 6 acre lake, and there's 3 rock piles and a pile of tires and some trees scattered here and there. Not enough. So trying to find that sweet spot of 25 to 30%, it's always more than you think it is, but that's the magic number.
With the sweet spot you're talking about, one thing I like to tell people is that habitat is important, but it's just as important for the angler. It attracts fish to an area that you can find the fish. So if you have that lake, like you said, that's 100% in structure, where do you fish? Where do you start? I mean, the fish are not going to concentrate anywhere. They're going to be widely spread, and you're going to spend all day chasing, 1 or 2 bites. Whereas if you've got a lunker bunker beside a brim bed, you can find those fish stacked up in that area, and you can catch multiple fish in one area without having to move the boat or fishing off the pier or from the bank. Keep in mind that the habitat's great for fish. Habitat placement is great for anglers. Put it where you can access it.
Yes, that you struck a point with me there. When I was a kid, I came across this crusty old angler who was a trot line fisherman in the Brazos River. He was upset because they were about to take his stretch of the river and turn it into a lake, and they were going to flood his river, and he was really mad about it. But then he turned and he pointed his finger at me. He said, "Son, you need to know this. 90% of the fish live in 10% of this river. And if you can figure out which 10% that is, you don't have to be a good fisherman. You're going to catch fish." Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm in my 42nd year as a fisheries biologist, and I'm going to this day, I believe that. I've drained enough lakes, I've electrofished enough lakes that on any given day, 90% of the fish are going to live in about 10% of that lake. But we really don't know what 10% that is because it shifts. It shifts with water temperature. That's the key point to remember. And when I'm designing fish habitat, I'm thinking temperature the whole time. Because I know that in the summertime, those fish are going to shift from the shallows into deeper water. So that's why I came up with 25 to 30% of a basin should be habitat of some sort, so it can also attract fish, so that 10% shifts through the course of the season. In fish, temperature is the most important thing, and it's even more important than oxygen. As long as the fish has enough oxygen to not die, it will go stick its nose in the thermocline. If the temperature is 92 degrees at the surface up there, but down here at the thermocline it's 78, they've got 3 parts per million oxygen, they'll stick their nose in that. And so that's part of the reason that I like to design fish attraction habitat that just dives down through the thermocline, so anglers have a target they can shoot at, knowing that fish is going to be deeper in July. And if we can congregate a few fish in July, then our catch rates go up. So that's real important.
I agree. And, You made a really good point in terms of that 30% number you picked out earlier. If fish only live in 10% of the water, then why 30%? It's because they live in 10% of that in the summer and a different 10% of that in, say, spring and fall, and a different 10% of that in the wintertime. That's right. Shifting. So if you can figure out where those fish are, then you can become a professional angler and do really well.
Yep. And then we kind of hedge our bets thinking that we might know what that 10% is. So I like to have that 30 because almost every time I help design a lake, I'll put a feature in that I think is going to be a home run and run the electrofishing boat over it years later, and nothing there. So we're putting science behind it, but we're also treating it like artwork, and we're kind of guessing at some of that as well. Hey, you know what? Something else that just hit me. I'm designing lakes now with outside predators in mind. I am now designing underwater habitat that a cormorant can't swim through, or a river otter is going to have to work at it to go catch a bass, hunkered down, and just kind of picture in your mind taking like a 30-foot oak tree, for example, cutting off all the limbs smaller than about 3 inches. So now we've got a matrix of a canopy, and taking that and putting it in an angle underwater where fish can at least go into that matrix. And a river otter is going to have to navigate that matrix to be able to get to that fish to eat it. So now I've kind of reconditioned my mindset to be thinking about, are there some features we can do underwater to help minimize the risk of annihilation by river otters or by, other predators?
I hadn't thought about making the habitat more otter-proof. It's a good point.
Well, I'm trying it, and I'll let you know how it works.
Bob, is there anything else that you must do before you fill the pond with water? I mean, I don't know how much you deal with ponds with water chemistry or soil chemistry issues. Do you lime ponds before you fill them, preferably?
Yes. Actually, the guy that I met with yesterday, I said, "Hey, man, right now you're in Northeast Texas. You're in piney woods country. Everybody limes the hay meadows around you. I could tell by looking at the water that's starting to flow in. It looks like iced tea. You need to go ahead and lime this thing." And he's got a few more things to do before he gets his fish structure all done. And I advised him to go ahead and get the lime truck in the bottom of that lake and spread that lime everywhere. So, yeah, if you can do all those things before you have water, it makes it easier. That's not to say that you can't do it after there's water in the lake. It's just a lot harder to do it. If you can do it now when there's no water in it, it's easier.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of other things, too, from the people side that you can do. I mean, if you want a boathouse, a fishing pier, a boat ramp, a swimming beach, any of these things, if you want to build fertilizer platforms, anything that requires construction, and you'll find it's a lot easier to do and do well, so that when the pond does fill with water, you'll have everything ready to go for your fish when they go in.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yesterday, this lake I was looking at, it's shaped almost like a tooth. You got the tooth, and then there's a couple of roots that come off the back of it. Well, he's going to build a home right there where these two little creeks come in to fill this lake. But right where where the two creeks come together, the water is only 5 feet deep. And so I said, "Where are you going to put your house?" He said, "Well, we're going to put it back here, and we're going to bring some dirt somewhere out of the basin of this pond for the house pad." I said, "Man, you need to do it right here at the confluence of these two creeks, because this is right by where your house is going to be. You've got two boys that are 8 and 10 years old. They're going to want to swim in this water. And if you will take this little area right here at the base of the tooth where the two roots come together at the confluence of those creeks, dig that down where it's 8 to 12 feet deep, then you've got a swimming hole for them. And you don't have very far to move the dirt to build your house pad with, and you've killed two birds with one stone." He said, "Well, we do want to put a dock right here. I was just going to put it in the creek where they could jump in the creek where it's deeper." I said, "No, man, let's go ahead and dig that out, because you need 3,000, ask him how much dirt he needs, 3,000 cubic yards for the house pad." Well, heck, that's a football field almost 2 feet deep. So he could take that area that's maybe 1/10 of an acre and excavate it down another 5 or 6 feet and he's got a pretty cool swimming hole. And then when he has his dock, he can put some, fish structure around the rim of that hole, and then set his feeder up on his dock and feed bluegill that'll come right out of that structure straight to the dock. And that's the kind of stuff you see, that's specific to a site. After you hear the goals of that landowner, you can make these kind of suggestions.
So now we've got our pond, we've got all of our habitat in place, we've got all of our amenities around the lake in place. It's starting to rain, starting to fill with water. Now it's time to start thinking about fish, Bob, right?
I tell you what I tell people, and I learned this the hard way. I tell people that I want at least 8 feet of water in the pond and at least half the surface area covered going into a rainy season. Then we'll stock forage fish. We'll stock fathead minnows, we'll stock bluegill fingerlings, we'll stock red ear sunfish, depending on what part of the planet and depending on the goals of that landowner. I mean, I've got guys, I've had guys look at me in the eye and say, hey, Bob, I don't even buy green bananas. I'm not sure I'll be here when they get ripe. So I don't want to stock those babies. I want to stock big fish. But if it's like most people are doing, I like to start with the forage fish, let them become established, stock, baby bluegills, because if they grow up in that lake, then they're going to be more accustomed to that environment and be able to be more, I guess the best word is successful. So that's my criteria. 8 feet of water, half the surface area covered going into a rainy season. Don't usually stock fish when it's cold or when it's hot. I like the fall or the spring.
So you just told the banana story. I remember you came up here to Starkville a while back and you told me the story about that landowner, which was absolutely hilarious.
Yeah, it was.
And a really good story about why it's not necessarily a good idea to move adult fish into a pond. Would you be willing to tell us that story, maybe an abbreviated version? Or
yeah, it's a very entertaining story. So I get a call from this guy. This is way back like in 1991. And he said, son, he says, I've been referred to you by a friend of yours that you've done some work for. He said, I'm 76 years old. I just sold my company and I'm making up for lost time. He says, I got 1,200 acres out here west of Houston and I've high fenced it and the deer are coming next week and I close on this land the week after. I said, whoa, you are in a hurry, aren't you? And I'd never worked with anybody like this at that point. And he said, now, son, listen. He said, I don't want to be buying these little finger-length fish like all you biologists like to tell people to do. He said, don't even buy green bananas. I'm not sure I'll be here when they get ripe. So I want to stock this lake where I can start fishing in it right away. So I said, well, it's going to cost a lot of money. He said, son, don't worry about the mule going blind. Load the wagon. So I thought, oh, this is really going to be fun. So he was going to build this 9-acre lake around the base of a hill and it's shaped like a quarter moon. So there was no watershed to feed this lake. So I pointed that out to him. I said, Mr. Terry, you don't have enough watershed to fill a 9-acre lake. He said, son, if we don't get enough rain to fill it, I'll drill a well. Well, he did, and he hit a well that was like 750 gallons a minute. So he built this lake, filled it with water, and this didn't take but maybe 3 months in the summer. So now we're getting into the fall, and he's ready for fish. So I said, Mr. Terry, if you want to stock it with bigger bass, he said, yes. I said, I've got a source where I can get, quite a few 1.5 pound to maybe 5 pound bass. He said, can you get me any double-digit fish? I said, nobody wants to sell double-digit fish. He said, well, ask them. Well, I had a client in North Texas with a big ranch and lots of ponds that they would never fish, and several of those ponds were muddy, and I knew there were double-digit fish because I'd electrofished them with the ranch manager before. And so I called that ranch manager, and I said, hey, listen, I've got this guy down that wants to buy a bunch of bass, and he wants to buy bass you've got because you've got the right gene pool that we want. And I said, he wants a couple of double-digit bass. And Ronnie says, I'm not selling any double-digit bass. Are you kidding me? I said, well, I didn't think you would, but I told him I'd call you and ask. He says, no. So I called Mr. Terry back, and I said, well, I can get you a whole bunch of 1.5 pound, 3 pound to 5 pound bass. It'll take me a few weeks to do that because we got to go shock them up out of these different ponds. He said, but he didn't want to sell any double-digit fish. He said, money whip him. I said, money whip him? He said, yeah. He said, everything's for sale, son. He says, money whip the guy. So I called Ronnie back and I said, Ronnie, and by this time we'd put bait fish in there. We'd stocked every species of forage fish that we could find. You know, we stocked bluegills, 5 or 6 sizes. We stocked threadfin shad. We stocked fatted minnows. The guy had spent $60,000 on bait fish, which he didn't care. He wanted to do that. So it was time for bass. And I guarantee you a fish, all they had to do was open their mouth and suck, and they'd get food in their mouths in that lake. That's how many bait fish were in it. And so I called Ronnie back and I said, Ronnie, he really doesn't want to buy the rest of your bass unless he gets 2 double-digit fish. And he said, no, I've already told you no. No, we're not going to do that. So I said, Ronnie, and this is way, way, way back in the day before people really understood what a double-digit bass was worth. So I said, would you take $200 for 2 double-digit bass a piece? He says, no. I said, would you take $500? And he paused. I thought, oh my gosh, he is going to sell these fish. All we got to do is negotiate the price. He said, would that idiot pay $500 a piece for a double-digit bass? I said, yeah, he would. He said, well, if he'll pay $500 a piece, you know, this is 30-something years ago, for 2 double-digit bass, and then he'll pay $25,000 for these other bass, then we can do that. So I called him back, called Mr. Terry back. He said, did you money whip him? I said, yes, I did. He says, good. How much are those double-digit bass going to cost? I said, $1,000 a piece. So I was kind of learning how to play his game with him, you know. And so we gathered up all those fish, hauled them down there, put them in. The biggest bass was 11 pounds and 7 ounces, and the other one was, I think, 10 pounds and 4 ounces. Well, then I helped him manage the lake for a couple of years after that. And this is when I began to figure out what happens when you take adult fish from that environment and go put them in that environment. That 11-pound, 7-ounce bass, after 1 year, had grown to a little over 10 pounds. And the 10.25-pound bass had grown to just right at 9 pounds. And they had all the bait fish they could eat. But they'd come out of muddy water. So they had learned how to make a living in muddy water, and that crystal clear, I say crystal clear, 36-inch visibility water didn't suit their conditioning. So those fish deteriorated. The second year, that biggest bass was a little over 8 pounds, and the second bass, I didn't get it, so I don't know what happened to it. But that's when I began to realize that when fish grow up in a certain environment and then you try to move them to a new environment, they don't necessarily make the cut. You know, and so that was the very first time I began to realize that it wasn't so smart to take adult bass and move them to another lake thinking that those fish are going to thrive. I mean, I could see it if you want to change the gene pool and have them reproduce once, but not move them from this lake where they grew up so well and put them into that one where they may not have a chance.
Did your client ever catch any of those fish?
No. The only time he saw those 2 big bass was in my electric fishing boat and the day that we stocked them in the lake. He never caught those bass. And what's really interesting about that guy, when he turned 80, he sold the ranch and did another one.
Built a whole new pond?
Yeah.
Did he ask for double-digit fish?
No, he learned his lesson. But you know what? That ranch served its purpose for him because he was wanting to make up for lost time because he was always at the office. He didn't take his kids fishing. They grew up not knowing how to hunt and fish, and he didn't want to do that with his grandkids. So he was able to bring his adult children there, and they spent several years, and they learned how to hunt deer and, you know, how to go fishing and catch fish. So he accomplished his mission with that ranch, and then he went and did another one. I guess he could have bought green bananas.
So, you know, once you've stocked the pond, Bob, and the fish are starting to grow, the best intentions always, you know, don't always work out. And sometimes we start off with a lake that is more difficult to manage than others. For example, when the lakes are not built properly to begin with and they've got way too much watershed to surface area, you have a hard time maintaining productivity in the lake, maintaining good growth rates. I know you've worked some with Richmond Mill. Is it Richmond Mill Lake in North Carolina? Mm-hmm. And that's a really unique lake that has gone a totally different direction.
That lake was built in 1835 with mules and Fresnos to capture water, to harness it, to turn a grist mill for the community. And to kind of put that in perspective, that was a year before Davy Crockett was killed in the Alamo. That was 10 years before Texas became a state.
Wow.
That's an old lake, to put it in perspective. And it flows anywhere from 4,000 to 8,000 gallons per minute over the spillway every day of water with a pH of 5.3. Looks like iced tea. They call it black water over there. And there's no way to lime it, no way to fertilize it. That's what you got to deal with. The family that owns that property bought it in 1872. So they're 5 or 6 generations into ownership. Well, this level of ownership, Dr. Jim Morgan, he wanted to see if he could take that lake and turn it into a premier fishery. So once we did our due diligence on the water chemistry, they had drained the lake and rebuilt the dam. And he had spent enough money rebuilding the dam that he wanted to try to recover some of that money by doing something commercially. So he wanted to create like a destination there. Well, in order to do that, you had to have good catch rates and decent fish. So I started working with Purina Mills to develop better fish foods, because the fish foods at that point were just mostly designed for supplementing sport fish rather than nurturing sport fish. And then we designed a way to present the feed on a Wi-Fi system with the different feeders, so we could feed different sizes of different species of fish around the lake. So we turned it into kind of a pseudo feedlot. And it was amazing to watch that lake develop. It developed over 10 or 12 years, and I'll circle back on that point here in a minute. But as it developed, we were using feed-trained largemouth bass, and we were feeding bluegills. And we decided that he had a big enough budget that he could feed, as much as he wanted. And since the water was pretty predictable, we weren't worried about adding too many nutrients. So what happened was there were 2 populations of fish that developed in that fishery. There were the feed-trained fish over here, then the native fish over here. And the native fish, you saw the same growth curves that you would see in almost any other lake. The difference was with the feed-trained fish, we were adding nutrients to the water that were making the fish grow, but then the fish waste was being recycled and being used by other species of fish. So we had our own little food chain kicking off because of the fact that we were feeding the largemouth bass and the bluegill. And we ended up growing a bunch of northern largemouth bass that knocked on the door of 8 pounds apiece. And there were several bluegill caught that were over 3 pounds. Bruce Condello caught 2 bluegills that were 3 pounds and 4 ounces. And then literally thousands of bluegill were caught that were 2 1/4 pounds. And then as Dr. Morgan got to his retirement age, he created a succession plan with his daughter, and she's more into weddings and photography. So she decided they were going to shift back and cut back on feeding the fish and start having use the place more as a wedding venue than a fishing venue. So then the lake began to go back down to what it was before we started doing any work. And so now it's kind of devolved back into what nature wants it to be, simply because it's not being propped up with so much fish food.
And that's an important point, is that management is not something you do once. It's not something you do occasionally. People that call me a lot of times are asking about fertilizer. I try to explain to them. I said, look, fertilization is not for everybody, but once you start it, it's something you pretty much stick with. Same thing with feeding program. You're feeding those fish. You basically tripled, quadrupled the carrying capacity of that lake or more. And, so it filled up with big fish. It's like you have 20 cats in your house, but you only buy enough food for one cat. Your cats aren't going to do very good.
No, they're going to eat your furniture.
Exactly.
So the way that they did this lake was they scaled it back. They didn't just cut it off. We had that conversation, and I knew they were going to change direction. So I said, you know what? Don't cut all the feed off at once. Just scale it back over about a 2 or 3 year period. And then the lake can level off. And, because here's a real important point about fisheries management, Wes. The fish are a response to what I call happy water. the best habitat and the food chain that lake has to offer. So the fish are a consequence. They're going to be a response to whatever the stimulus is that the managers choose or that the lake does on its own merit. That's why I like to have the best habitat, monitor water chemistry, make sure the water's happy, and then do the best we can to make sure that the food chain's working good.
Exactly. There are, 4 factors that really go into growing fish. I mean, we talk about genetics, we talk about food, we talk about environment, like water temperature, for example, and we talk about age. All 4 factors go into whether or not a fish is big, but all 4 factors have to align to grow a trophy bass. Management's important, harvest is important, all these things are important. And if we slack off on just one, a lot of times things can go south in a hurry.
And people don't realize that, if one of the goals is to grow trophy bass, that fish doesn't need to miss a meal. And typically, in most lakes, of course, you have the new lake syndrome where you got the best shot at growing double-digit bass, especially. But if a bass sits at 12 or 13 inches for 6 months, its growth potential is shot. It's not going to be able to hit at the other end of its life what it could have hit if it had the food that it needed. And that's why harvest is important. Selective harvest is a big, big deal if you're trying to make some fish grow big. Because if you're not culling, you won't find out about it till 8 or 10 years down the road when those fish top out, at 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 pounds or, whatever that whatever that fish can do. So all those things, and they're in order too. I'm going to shut up, I promise. Happy water, great habitat, the best food chain, genetics, and a harvest plan. If you don't have all those things in that sequence, it's not going to work nearly as well as you want it to.
But do you find that once you've let that situation develop to where you've got a crowded situation where you have a lot of small bass that are hungry and they tend to be in poor condition, their bellies are sunken in, it's almost impossible to correct that just through harvest because, first, all the energy that they get is used to recover their condition before they can even get back to the business of growing. Do you find that there's a point when it's almost a population of largemouth bass, for example, is too far gone to recover through harvest alone?
Yes, I've seen that way more times than I like to even think about. Matter of fact, I'm going to tell you that's probably the dominant situation that I come across where somebody buys a property and they're excited about the lake and the lake hasn't been managed or no fish harvested for 10 years. And you get in there and you start looking and there's, 10 to 12 inch bass that are 6 years old. And there's no chance those fish can get much bigger than 3 or 4 pounds. Doesn't matter what you do. You can money whip it with bait fish and won't make a difference. And until you start culling it, all those bass you can get out and their young of the year start coming up the pipe, and that might take 3 years. So sometimes it's better just to reset and start over, but that's a decision I think people need to make with good data, age data, length, weight data. So, the assistance of a fisheries biologist in a case like that could be smart. Because it might be smarter just to go in and take them all out and start again.
Getting people to kill out a pond and start over again is tough, not only from the financial side, but from the temporal side, how long it takes, because you're looking at 3-4 years before you start catching decent fish again. And even then, you've got to convince them to start harvesting bass out again, or else they're going to find themselves in exactly the same situation down the road.
That's right. It's rock solid. I see that happen a lot, and one of the things we try to do with folks that don't want to kill their fish out is, okay, then why don't you just write a check and let's bring the electrofishing boat over and see if we can at least harvest a significant number of bass that we can replace with better fish, rebuild the food chain, and let's go from there. But one thing I've learned now at age 67 is I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. What I'm going to do is educate them the best I can with my life's experiences and the opinions and facts that I know, and then they get to make a decision, and then they get to live with it. So I'm going to lay the facts out there. I'm going to tell you what I've seen. Here it is. Now, you choose. You do what you want to do. I'm here to help as much as I can, but you're going to be the one living with it 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road.
And Bob, you mentioned that sometimes they just want to break out the checkbook and have you bring the electrofishing boat in. Do you find that if you take a large biomass of fish out all at once, especially like in the spring when we like to electrofish the spring a lot, do you find that that's not as effective as harvest? Because when fish are taken out all at once in, say, April and May, a lot of times remaining fish just get a high recruitment, a good year class, and fill the ranks back up with more small bass. Whereas if you're taking fish out all year long through harvest, particularly in the fall, once a year class strength has been set, you find that you have more success manipulating populations than trying to do it all at once?
Yes. Now, the only reason I would do it all at once is if that fishery has been set like that for 4 or 5 or 6 years. Then I'd say, yeah, let's harvest the masses as we can, but be ready. You're going to be doing it again in the fall because you're going to have high recruitment, but you're going to have high recruitment of young fish. Okay, so there's going to be some of those that are going to excel. My experience has been that out of a given class of fish that there's, of course, half of them are boys, half are girls. You can throw the boys away because they're not going to get big. Then out of those remaining girls, there's going to be a percentage of those that can thrive in that environment. And if we can protect those are the ones with the relative weights that are, 105 to 125. And if we can protect those and cull the other ones that aren't performing as well, then we can see a difference. But it gets a little complicated, because you got to predict. You got to look ahead at based on the, one of the pieces of advice I give people all the time is you have a decision to make. That decision could be to do this or do nothing, or it could be one of these 3 things or do nothing. Whatever decision you choose has consequences. And if you can look forward to predict what those consequences might be, then you can make a smarter decision that fits into your goals and your budget and your timeline.
Well, Bob, that sounds like a great place to finish up. Unless you want to add anything else, I appreciate you coming today.
Yeah, this has been fun, Wes. I appreciate it. I'll be around. People can find me at pondboss.com. If they want to email me, they can do it at info@pondboss.com, and I'll get that email, and happy to help in any ways that we can. And we've got a resource guide full of different vendors and folks that can help people. And Pond Boss Magazine, I tell on my podcast, $35 a year, cheaper than a Friday night date, and it lasts a year. So we'd love to have more people hang out with us.
Bob, thanks for coming on, and I hope everyone will join me for my next episode. Thanks, Bob.
Excellent. Keep it up. Keep up the great work, Wes. Thanks for the time today. See you, buddy.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.